We're pleased that our third speaker also made it. There was some worry that his plane wouldn't land in time, but fortunately he did. Pedro Noguera is the Peter Agnew Professor of Education at NYU's Steinhardt School of Education. He's a sociologist whose scholarship and research focuses on the way in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions. Leo has had considerable experience working with Pedro on a whole variety of areas, and one of the things he emphasized to me in telling me about Pedro was his that he is actively engaged in working with schools and teachers on a whole variety of issues, particularly including discipline. He's consulting with, I believe, the Syracuse public schools right now on some major issues around discipline, particularly of boys of color. And that these are some areas in which he doesn't shy away from jumping in, getting involved. His academic research focuses on this, but he also engages in the public square in important ways, and we're very pleased that he is able to join us today. Thank you, Pedro.
I just want to say I'm not leaving because Pedro's about to go.
Oh, yeah, right, Deb.
Debbie's got a plane to catch.
I have to go to a memorial service, yes.
Sorry. So good morning. And I'm glad to have made him. Sorry to see Deb leaving, but hopefully I'll get to catch up with her in the near future. Delta decided to cancel both flights this morning. I think it wasn't full, so they decided to make me wait. But I'm glad to be here nonetheless. Although I didn't get to hear only the end of Deb, Deb and I have worked for a long time together, so I'm sure I have a sense of the kinds of things she would have said. And I was really glad to hear Tina this morning, and I want to just say her remarks echo my own sentiments, and I'll come back to those in a moment. In thinking about the defense of the public square and what it means to support and defend public education at this time and recognize its role in American democracy, I thought I would have to connect this issue to what's happened in Baltimore and also in Atlanta. And that's because anytime you have a democracy where people are literally burning buildings and police cars, where there's the kind of turmoil we've seen for the last several days over yet another police killing that's now going to result in, again, marches in several cities across the country, including this one today. I think it should give us all pause and ask what is happening in this democracy. What does it mean when a major American city is up in flames? And where does education fit into that? And we know that from the commentators, education did fit in because there was a big debate about whether or not to close the schools and whether or not keeping them open was going to actually give students an ability to organize and create more disturbances, or would closing them actually result in more kids being unsupervised out in the streets? And this is the kind of debate which then forces us to reflect back that one of the original purposes of the schools was simply to have a place to put kids, right? A custodial function. And that custodial function, I remember when Richmond, California was about to close its schools because they ran out of money, it was the police who first stepped up and said, you can't do this because it's going to create a problem for us. But those who followed Baltimore also know that part of what made the situation so unpredictable was that kids on their own had connected via social media and met up in places that the police had not anticipated them, such as the mall. And so, again, it speaks to the power of young people in this current age of where social media gives them access in ways they hadn't before. I want to talk about Baltimore because I think context matters. You can't really talk about education democracy without looking at the context in which education is occurring in, although I think most of our policies do. We tend to adopt the same policies regardless of context, regardless of social and economic conditions. And that's one of the reasons why I would say we've had so many reforms and so little impact, particularly on places like Baltimore. The schools in Baltimore, put most simply, and I would say this is true in most cities across America, have not been organized to meet the needs of the children they serve or the community it's in. And as a result, it is complicit in the failure of that city. That city is a failed city. If we were talking about states, we would describe Baltimore as a failed state, right? It's a place where not only do the police occupy the city like an occupying army, but where most institutions simply don't work, right? Some people of us know Baltimore mostly through television, through The Wire, right? Unless, like myself, you've spent time there. But if you think about The Wire, which was widely regarded as one of America's most important and inventive television shows, what did it depict? It depicted a city ravaged by violence and drug trafficking, managed by corrupt policemen and corrupt politicians, and it was still entertainment. Right? And it was on for several series. Right? And what was entertaining about it, right, is what we should ask ourselves. What made that such compelling television, right? I would say there's a kind of voyeurism that exists in this America about urban suffering. And there's a way in which, as long as that suffering can be contained in certain areas, it's really not a problem. Right? Because the fact is that Baltimore is not an isolated, desolate community. We know across the country there are places like Detroit and New Orleans and you name it, Camden, Newark, Buffalo. We can go on and on. In fact, what's interesting about the 10 poorest cities in America is that they haven't had riots, is that 4 of them are black, but 3 of them are white, and 3 of them are Latino. It's that that's not been an issue that's been discussed in this country openly by policymakers since the Johnson administration and the war on poverty. That is that even as Baltimore forces policymakers, including the Obama administration, to address it, what do they talk about? They talk about policing. They don't talk about the underlying issues. There was a sociologist on WNYC, he was actually a police sociologist, explaining why there weren't riots in New York City after Eric Garner's murder. And he said, well, unlike Baltimore, even in the poorest neighborhoods in New York City, most people have jobs. And most people have to go to work every day. That's not true in Baltimore. The depth of the poverty, the depth of the marginalization, I think, is the fuel that drives this anger, and just as much as Freddie Gray's killing. And so, again, context matters. Should we be surprised if in this context schools would be troubled in Baltimore? It would be surprising if they weren't. I want to encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to read a book by a former Teach for America teacher in Baltimore called Teaching at the Terror Dome, right, about her years teaching at a high school in Baltimore, being totally unprepared for the task, right, after 6 weeks of training, being assigned to work with special ed students in high school who could not read, and the stress and anguish that she and her colleagues went because the only thing they got from the administration was pressure. Pressure to improve, pressure to perform. Nothing in the way of support, nothing in the way of resources. And you read a story like that, and it's not merely a story about the inadequacy of Teach for America as a strategy. It's a story about the ways in which our policies are complicit in the failure of districts like Baltimore. I remember a few years ago, Baltimore was getting praise because it had reduced suspension rates. Right? And I knew the former superintendent, Andres Alonso, and I said, Andres, it's great to reduce suspension rates, but has the learning climate improved? Right? That is, this is our safe, orderly place where kids are learning and engaged. He said, well, we're not there yet. We keep missing the point. It's not good enough to focus on one slice of a problem and overlook the larger set of issues. Right? And so when you go into our cities and you see schools that are crumbling and that are not functioning, and where kids are not learning and where disorder is pervasive, it's not surprising that increasingly they look like prisons. And that increasingly we see kids being arrested in school for offenses that were never criminal before. And this is happening in hundreds of schools across the country now, where police have replaced hall monitors, and where kids are being arrested for things like kicking a Garbage can, if you lifted the report today on NPR, they were talking about cases in Lynchburg, Virginia, of kids being arrested, special ed students, for behavior that was never seen as criminal before. And so I would say that, particularly in our urban areas, though it's not limited to our urban areas, our schools are, and the non-functioning of our schools are a reflection of our democracy and its inadequacy. It's the ways in which it's been undermined by growing inequality. We've known for a while, and we're going to hear a lot about inequality in this next campaign because even the Republicans can't ignore it anymore. But like global warming, right, which is just kind of creeping up, we've known for a while that rising inequality breeds with it, creates rising resentments, right, creates instability. And I would say what should concern all of us is the fact that Baltimore could easily be another city, some other part of the country, with just another trigger incident like this, because the conditions are ripe everywhere. How is it possible, for example, that as the Obama administration was talking about saving Detroit, right, and that's not what they ran on in 2012, that they had saved Detroit. Detroit's not been saved, at least not for the people of Detroit. The auto industry may be recovered. But you go to Detroit, you still find a devastated city, right? A city that they have decided to allow go to wilderness in vast sections because they didn't know what else to do with city because they're unable to provide public services, even light and water. And so, again, in this context, we shouldn't be surprised that schools fail, that schools are overwhelmed, but that schools are not able to meet the needs of their students because they haven't been organized for that purpose. And that brings me to Atlanta. And although the Judge Baxter, just lowered the sentences from 7 to 3 years, it's shocking to me that in this case about cheating, which no one, I think, can reasonably support, we've overlooked two really important factors. One is that Atlanta public schools were actually improving under Beverly Hall. We have independent evidence that can't be treated on, the NAEP scores, which show us that. And Mike Smith, the former Assistant Secretary of Education, former Dean of Stanford, is one of the people who said, look, Atlanta was improving. I went to Atlanta. I spent many visits there. Went to Park Middle School, which was called the epicenter of the cheating scandal. Saw a school that was transformed from a highly dysfunctional school to one where kids were learning, where the culture had improved, where there was real focus. Now, they didn't improve as much as they claimed, clearly, but they did improve. But they didn't satisfy the governor, the same governor, Sonny Perdue, who launched the investigation, right, who was applying the pressure. And it's so ironic because when Atlanta was making its gains and Beverly Hall was being recognized and invited to Washington and being celebrated as Superintendent of the Year, and her picture was being taken with by Arnie Duncan, everyone wanted to celebrate the accomplishments. But when the cheating was uncovered, they ran away like they never knew her, and they knew nothing about Atlanta. And that the pressure that was applied had nothing to do with the cheating that went on. Read the New Yorker article about Atlanta and the pressure on those teachers who were committed to kids to raise scores and erase their marks. Again, to me, this is a sign of a corrupt system, a system that is so far removed from actually educating its kids that instead, because we focus so narrowly on raising test scores. And so Atlanta, to me, is a lesson in the failure of policy. You know, Tina's talked about the way in which we use threats and money as a way to get schools to improve. Right? I would say that Atlanta is the epitome of how both were used. Right? The bonuses to reward the rise in raises and the threats on people's jobs. Neither strategy is effective if you're serious about actually creating schools that are sustainable and improvement that's sustainable over time. Which takes me to the point, what would it look like? What would it look like if we were actually serious about creating schools in poor communities that could contribute to the well-being of the community, that could contribute to this democracy because it was educating kids to participate fully in it? What would that look like? Well, I get to travel to schools all around the country, and I get to see such schools. And ironically, they show up in places you might not expect. One is a school in Bedford-Stuyvesant I work with called the Brooklyn School for Leadership and Community Service. a school where all the kids have been kicked out of the traditional high schools, and a school that functions as a beacon of support in a community that is deeply challenged by economic and social marginalization. And it's a school that is able to provide services to kids because they know they have a high-need population, so it is a community school that you just heard about. It has a partnership with a local agency, the Good Shepherd. But beyond that, it's a school that functions as a community, as a family. I was talking to a young man, the valedictorian of the school, who for 3 months lived in the stairwell of his building while he was homeless. He told me he was given food by his neighbors. I said, how did you manage to be valedictorian? He said, because every day I got to school, they took care of me. This became my new family. I got a shower here. I got clothes here. I got fed here. I wanted to stay here all the time because I had no other place to go. I met another student who was 400 pounds. That's how much he weighed when he entered the school. He said he had stopped going to school because he was embarrassed by his obesity. And when he got to the school, because his mother made him, the PE teacher came to him and says, if you come to school, I will be your personal trainer. I will help you lose weight. And for the next 6 months, he proceeded to work out and walk to school a good 8 miles each way. And this whole school cheered him on as he lost 150 pounds. I mean, this is a place that, despite serving kids from 5 different boroughs, where there are 5 different gangs at the school, finds a way to have no violence amongst the kids, and finds a way to meet the needs. Is it as good as school in the suburbs? Well, I don't think we should expect it to be. But is it providing those kids with an education that will prepare them after graduation? I think so, despite the odds. Interestingly, you could find districts like this in other places, like Brownsville, Texas. Little Brownsville, Texas on the border, a very poor, impoverished community. But it's a high-functioning school system. Do you know why? Because the people who work in the schools also live in Brownsville. The high school principal is also the former coach of the football team. He said, everybody's related here. Everybody knows each other. He said, if I run into the supermarket, I run into half the families I serve. And you know what that generates? It generates a sense of mutual accountability. He said, I have to serve these kids well. These are my kids. These are my neighbor's kids. And so despite the fact that it's an impoverished community, despite the fact that it's a very marginal place, that most people, not many people go to visit Brownsville unless they have family there. Right? It has a graduation rate of over 90%. And they are sending kids on to college. And it's showing that, yes, poverty is a huge obstacle, but poverty is not a learning disability. And when the schools are organized to meet the needs of the kids, you can actually get good results. And then the last district I'll talk about is a place, again, you wouldn't expect to find a beacon of hope, and that's Tulsa, Oklahoma. Wow, Tulsa, Oklahoma. They had a universal preschool long before New York, Boston, or Seattle. Right? Because like the many other parts of the state of Oklahoma, they recognized a long time ago that the education we provide to infants lays a foundation. Every school in Tulsa is a community school. That means that there's a broad array of health services and social services provided at each school. But beyond that, the top performing high school in Baltimore, in Tulsa, Booker T. Washington, is integrated, over 50% African American. It is the second highest performing school in the state of Oklahoma. They believe that integration is key to their success as a system. So this is in this Republican heartland. This is, I was given a tour of Tulsa, taken to Greenwood. Greenwood is the neighborhood that burned in the 1924 riots, the race riots of 24, where the black community was burnt out of Tulsa, 300 people killed by mobs. And the former police officer who serves on the city council took me around the community, took me to see Greenwood, took me to the memorial that was built for the victims, where a statue of John Hope Franklin was erected by his former pupils. And he said, I said, what is the point of bringing me here? He says, because I want you to understand why we're doing this community schools work. He said, this is our form of reparations. This is the way we're going to make it right again for what happened before. This is a former cop, current Republican. Right? He gets it. If we're serious about a school system that will contribute to our democracy, we've got to be serious about rooting our kids in an understanding of their history and equipping them with the skills and the mindset to confront the broad array of social and economic problems facing this country, so that rather than thinking that the only thing they can do is look out for themselves, that they can actually be prepared to take on those challenges and come up with solutions that this generation hasn't been able to provide. I'm actually encouraged when I get to visit schools, more encouraged than when I'm watching television, that's for sure. And I'm encouraged because in many places I see educators and parents and kids struggling and grappling with very challenging issues and often coming up with answers that policymakers never would have considered. I'm not encouraged by what I see happening in Washington, including with that was passing for a compromise bill and reauthorization of ESEA. Nor am I too impressed by what I see coming out of most state governments, with the exception of California. Right now, California is the first state to adopt an equity-based budget, which will give local control and local resources and say over how money is spent. It's ironic that Jerry Brown in his second term, come back again, his return to public office has, I think, shown us a renewed commitment not only to public education, but towards equity as a practice and a principle in the state. And so I think that while the public square is definitely endangered, there are signs that there is good work going on in disparate parts of the country that give us reason to hope that maybe American democracy might just still have a chance. Thank you.